We've got some breaking news from North Harris County where
deputies say 2 men and women were injured in a domestic shooting and stabbing.
Investigators say one of the men walked in and shot the woman who is believed to be his ex-girlfriend.
Police tell us they are responding to the motel for a domestic
call when they got on scene.
They found the woman dead and her injured daughter.
Neighbors woke up to gunfire early this morning. And
Harris County homicide detectives are on the scene right now.
A man in his 30s showed up to his ex-girlfriend's home, armed with a pistol.
A Missouri City police officer appeared in court this morning.
Accused of assaulting her fiance with her police baton.
The man accused of setting his estranged wife's house on fire.
He then waited until his wife came out of the home and then hit her with his car.
A woman is recovering from cuts and bruises
after she says the man she met on the Bumble dating app held her against her will for 5 days.
A community remembers 21-year-old Angie Diaz.
29-year-old Wendy
29-year-old Wendy Duane.
A 25-year-old woman.
A local woman.
A Houston woman.
Was known as a hard worker.
With a happy personality.
A tragic loss.
We're breaking free from domestic violence, finding you solutions, connecting you to help.
Because no matter who you are, where you're from, or who you love, you deserve to be free from violence.
Breaking Free, our week-long initiative. We wanted to continue this very, very important conversation on our live stream, KPRC 2+. We thank all of you so much for joining us because this is a very important discussion that we need to continue to have.
Yeah, all week long we have been covering stories about breaking free, but it's been months and months that we've been talking about cases and stories in our own newscast, in our own community, about domestic violence cases, very sad cases, and we want to shed light on that. We want to talk more about it openly so we can help prevent, we can help people speak up, and we can give resources and information. So that's why we are here to do that, and we have asked our panel of experts to join us, and we thank you so much for joining us because you've been studying this, you've researched this, you see this and witness this on a daily basis. And so we come to you for answers and for resources, and so for our viewers, and so this is an open conversation.
Yes, we're going to start off with our first panel of guests and experts. We thank you all so much for being here. This is going to be for 90 minutes. So we're going to have 3 half hours of this information that is so important and so critical, and we're going to have different experts. But this first panel that we have.
Before you say that, let's talk about the texting. You guys can text us your questions. We have some of our coworkers are here standing by wanting to answer your questions. They're going to relay the questions that you have to us, and we're going to ask the experts. That number that you need to text is on the bottom of your screen. So you can do that anytime, and then we'll get the text message and we'll try to answer your question as best we can. Yeah, let's go ahead and introduce you to our first panel. We first have Rachna Khare, Daya. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And then we also have Emilee Whitehurst with Houston Area Women's Center.
And Dr. Elizabeth Gregory with the University of Houston, and Mr. Jaime Rivera with Catholic Charities. And so we're going to just ping pong some questions at you, but I want to first just start off by asking, what are you seeing right now in domestic violence? Because from what we've been covering and our reporters have been covering on the streets, like, we see it, I don't know if there's clearly a rise, but we're telling more and more of these tragic stories. What are you seeing in your organization?
So, of course, we're seeing, similar to what you all are seeing, the tragic stories that are making the news, but I think the other thing that we're really seeing is so much resilience. Mm-hmm. There's definitely an increase in callers at Daya. Our client volumes went up by 41% just over the last year. But we are seeing staff that are getting more collaborative. We work with all of these folks here, more nimble, more responsive, to be able to meet clients where they are, help them plan for their safety, whether they're in a position where they can flee that relationship, whether they have already fled that relationship, or whether they're still struggling to stabilize after fleeing.
It sounds like people are starting to speak up and to reach out. What's leading to that change? What has led to that change? Why are we hearing from more people now? And seemingly this is an issue that so many of us probably have dealt with or seen in one way or another in our families. I know I saw it with one of my relatives. Why are people speaking out now?
I think it's things like what you just said, the bravery it takes to say, hey, this is happening, has happened in my family, this has happened to me or to my friends, And collectively, our agencies are really working together to get our messaging on point, to be able to refer to the proper agencies to get people to the right places. And I think as more and more people are getting the help they need and improving their safety, they're encouraging others in their life to do the same.
Right. And we're seeing with a lot of the stories that we did, and please feel free to interject at any point because you know what your expertise is. You know, we want to have a conversation where we can engage and interact here. But we've also been seeing that this isn't just like a intimate partner domestic violence. I mean, this is going, we've seen domestic violence in seniors and in the LGBTQ community, you know, between children and parents. And so there's so much to cover and so much to talk about. I want to talk about the University of Houston research in the study that's been done. Just tell us a little bit about what is the most recent research that you've found with domestic violence and what's happening in our community right now, and especially since after COVID, because we saw a huge rise during COVID. A lot of families spending more time together. You know, people are losing jobs and people are getting sick.
Yeah, those
and it really shakes,
increasing.
You know, a house to its core. And what have you found in your research?
Well, I guess there are two stories. One is that stress and a lot of different kinds of factors that are so unusual, like the lockdown where people were locked in with their abusers. And we interviewed one person who was being abused and she could hear the neighbor abusing his wife and yelling at her, you know, this is a pandemic, the police aren't coming. So there was this sense that the entire apartment building was in the same sort of stressful situation. So there was a lot of new pressure on people. They didn't have jobs. Their kids were home full time. That's another kind of pressure on people. You know.
For sure.
But at the same time, you have, as Rachna was saying, a lot of response in the provider community around innovating and trying to do more mobile advocacy, going into the community, using text hotlines and things like that, so that they were being more responsive to the community needs and trying to get the story out so that people would be able to, you know, say, I need help. Yeah. But as pointed out, there's also what we found looking at the data, and this is just from HPD and the sheriff, and there are actually 83 police departments in Harris County, so we're just looking at some of, these are the two biggest ones. The homicides doubled between 2019, before the pandemic, and this year. So, and they've been rising across those 3 years. So it wasn't like, okay, there was a spike during COVID and then it went down again. That spike has continued.
It's continued.
And then there
must be very concerning for what for what you're all seeing, right, in your organizations.
Yeah, one of the stories that I did, the story that I did was teaching young men and boys how to avoid becoming an abuser in the future. And one alarming quote I got was, my goodness, that 2022 was a nightmare. And at least in Harris County, and I'm sure probably reflective throughout the entire country on the heels of COVID. You all know these numbers from the Texas Coalition of Family Violence. 46 people killed in Harris County in 2021 by an intimate partner. That was up from 37 from 2020. And they don't have the numbers quite yet, but they believe in 2022 that number is going to jump to about 81, which is almost double from the previous year.
That is a data point that's known.
Yeah,
it has been.
They are reporting it. So, you know, there's never an excuse, obviously, but, you know, one of the reasons that I think you all can tell us that we've seen this increase is because another reason is that there were people, you know, abusers would be gone when they had jobs for 8 or more hours a day, and that would at least give the victim some type of break.
And
but
it's
now
time
they're
to be able to call for help.
Yes,
too,
exactly.
you know?
I think a thing we have to really be willing to talk about is the prevalence of guns. What would have potentially been a very harmful, hurtful, violent situation would not necessarily have been lethal, but for the fact that there's a gun in the home. If there's a gun in a home, someone is 500 more times likely
to use it,
to be killed. When people call our hotline, and we, like the other agencies represented here, have seen an enormous spike in calls to our hotline, which is a good thing in the sense that people are reaching out. But one of the first things that we ask is there a gun in the home? Because guns have become more prevalent in our community, and despite the best efforts of community organizations like ours to make sure that abusers don't have access to guns, that's not always feasible. So what I just think, the fact that y'all are having to go out again and again and again, scene after scene after scene, to homicides, that is most likely because of a gun. And it is, you know, survivors are incredibly resilient and committed most times to navigating these situations and de-escalating. But there's not much you can do when it changes the entire dynamic. A gun in the home changes the entire dynamic. And we need to really be able to talk about that.
So are you all familiar with the U.S. versus Rahimi case? Yes. Okay. We reported that on our newscast today.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about it.
Yeah, please.
Let me just say that this is a very alarming decision by a panel at the Fifth Circuit, which is over Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi.
Based in New Orleans, yes.
Yes, yeah. And what this means is, and people should know that the law that allowed a survivor to get safety from an abuser, known abuser, that a judge would say, you're a known abuser, you are no longer allowed to have access to your firearm. The Fifth Circuit said, no, that's not going to hold any longer.
Second Amendment rights trumped it. Yes.
That's correct.
And
according to them, now it's not sound legal reasoning in my opinion, but I think we should note that in the midst of this alarming increase in homicides, we have a court saying, oh, let's just make these abusers even more access to guns. That's not right. It's not right.
73% of the homicides here in the past 4 years were committed with a gun.
Right.
And if those people hadn't had a gun, then they might have just been a fight.
Right.
So there wouldn't have
Which
been a
doesn't
homicide.
make it, and I don't want to minimize somebody in a situation where the gun is not the tool of choice.
Right.
Listen, this emotional abuse, financial abuse.
There's different types
all
of abuse.
kinds. And so I want us to be aware of that. But when you're going scene after scene after scene to report on homicides, that's because we do not have the right attitude around guns in our community.
Hey guys, Jason, one of our
went over here. We got a question that just came in. Want to ask you folks, what are the laws on threats and threatening behavior regarding domestic violence if it is someone who doesn't live with you?
Okay, so maybe not necessarily already engaging in, some sort of violence, but just like threats, and so this should be taken seriously.
Or an intimate partner that doesn't reside in your household.
Right. That's still an abuse.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we have to think about is escalation, right? I think when you're talking about threats, right, it can easily escalate into something that becomes more violent.
Right.
And so when we're talking about threats, either that's verbal or manipulation, whatever it may be, you're putting the survivor or the person in a very awkward position where they're having to reach out and say, I need support. But some of our communities feel that they may not have the voice to even make that outcry. And especially when they're dealing with, vulnerable populations, accessing resources and being able to stand up and speak for yourself when you feel like you don't have a voice is very difficult.
So are receiving the threats a form of domestic abuse and violence? And so what should they do?
It's actually, that's like such an uncertain space. You were talking about psychological abuse, emotional abuse.
Right.
These are things that if you call law enforcement, there isn't much that can be done yet, right? And so this is where safety planning comes in handy so much. If you call one of our agencies, here's where we can help you
with
improve your safety for psychological abuse. There are threats that you can call law enforcement for, but depending on where you are, who you are, what language you speak, what is your immigration status, there's so many barriers why people are afraid to call. And if nothing comes of that police report or that call,
then they may not call again.
Well, and that survivor may be at higher risk because now you've called the police on me.
Right.
And so it's a dangerous place. It's a dangerous thing to do.
Speaking of those barriers, what are some of the barriers that keep people in those relationships? Because a lot of folks looking on the outside, they would hear the situation and say, why in the world would you continue to take that abuse? But there are multifaceted the reasons why people stay. Talk about that part of it.
I mean, one of the things that we're seeing in our communities is that there's a type of manipulation that's going on in the household. And the abuser is making it seem that there's 100% dependence on them. For emotional, for financial, for safety.
For children, because of
definitely children too. And so there's an amount of responsibility that they're intentionally putting on that person that they're abusing to make them feel that I'm the one that's going to be dependent on, and you can't survive without me.
And what I'm so thankful about for us doing this kind of programming tonight is that people don't realize there are resources available.
Right, definitely.
And if you're in a situation where you feel like you're having to choose between being homeless, not being able to feed your kids, not being able to have any transportation,
losing your immigration status,
or trying to just make it work with the situation that is not good and not safe and really tough, but my gosh, I can't take my kids out on the street. I can't lose my immigration status. But here's the good news. Programs like Catholic Charities and Daya and the Houston Area Women's Center, there are resources available, and that choice, that abuser is manipulating that situation to their end. It's not true. There are resources available, there are legal remedies, and there is safety. Now, that doesn't mean that it's everything that is so awesome, because you've talked a lot about affordable housing. The lack of affordable housing can be a real problem. Well, not just safe housing, but if you can't afford rent, if there's not anywhere to live that you can afford, we have a collective problem, because we are collectively then implicated in people being forced to stay in abusive situations because they can't afford to get out.
Well, and I will also say that, what we've learned is that domestic violence is rooted in control. And when the survivor flees the relationship, that's the most unsafe time. That's the time that they're at highest risk
Because the
for
abuser
homicide.
has lost that control. And
Absolutely. And then they become unhinged, and that's where we see these homicides happen. Primarily, and I'm sure you all see it, it's the person was fleeing or in the process of leaving, and that's when this homicide happened.
Along with that personal dynamic, there's also, when you step back, an element of group responsibility for putting people in circumstances where they are so impoverished. We have such low wages, particularly for women. And then our school system is not set up to allow moms to work consistently, because why does school let out at 3:30 when work doesn't let out till 5 o'clock? And so people get stuck in part-time jobs where they're bringing in very low wages, and there's very little affordable housing, and this makes people vulnerable. It does make them actually dependent for many resources. And once you're in a dependent situation, you become vulnerable. So there's a part of the dialogue for the community has to be about what is our responsibility around making women safe, as opposed to saying, especially moms, saying, that's your family, it's your problem.
Yes. We have another question over here.
Yes.
Hey guys.
Andrea,
I'm a producer over here. We have a question. I need to find a shelter. I have nowhere to go. This person says I'm injured from being beaten.
Oh, goodness.
So luckily, Houston has a lot
steps.
of resources, and where's the first place they can go where they know they will be safe?
They should call our hotline, the Houston Area Women's Center hotline, and they can go to www.hawc.org.
What if they can't call? What if they can't search something because they're being monitored? Can they just show up?
Absolutely, they can show up, but they need to know where to go.
Right.
And how about being able to text as well? Because they could have someone in a room with them, but maybe texting is a little safer.
But here's the thing, a lot of that stuff is monitored.
They can text. Yeah, of course. Obviously, she's texting now. Yes, yeah.
And I ask because a lot of the things are monitored. When you have an abuser, they're saying, who are you texting? Who are you calling? And so sometimes you don't have access to that.
Well, and here's the responsibility of us as friends and family. Instead of asking, why doesn't she leave, or this is not my business, can you offer somebody your phone to make that phone call?
Right.
Can you go on a walk with them?
Or the grocery store.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those are ways that everyday people can help intervene. And when you call a shelter like Houston Area Women's Center, even if there's not space at the moment, because we work so closely together, we have ways to where we can quickly figure out where can you go.
So this person who just sent us that, go to the Houston Area Women's Center. Can you, if they're watching clearly, so tell them exactly where it's located.
www.hawc.org. And that's going to be their best thing. They can chat or call and text.
The addresses are always confidential because of the safety issues.
Yes, obviously, yes.
That's very true. I do want to touch on something, and I think each of you could probably speak of your research or your organizations, is the cultural differences. I come from a Hispanic background where divorce or just acknowledging abuse is shameful, is to just talk about it. And that's in a lot of cultures, not just a Latino, Hispanic culture. But how do you break away from that and break that cycle of having to live in that and just say, oh, just, you know, sweep it under the rug and act like it's not happening, and what happens inside your walls, it's your business. How do you get away from that?
We were just talking about this, between the Hispanic culture and the South Asian culture, this stigma against divorce is just, it's wild, you know? And one thing that we often get accused of, I'm sure y'all too, is you're breaking up families. And we'd like to, you know, what I try to do is switch that framework. Like, this family that is living in fear and violence is broken. And what we're trying to do is reimagine a healed family. And, you know, there are so many barriers, but I think speaking to somebody in your own language is helpful, and you could talk about that counseling.
I mean, I think that's something that we spend a lot of time on. Within our department itself at Catholic Charities, all of our therapists, clinicians, we speak Spanish and English. Because allowing the client, allowing the survivor to be able to express themselves in their language of choice and identifying with someone in their culture really makes that connection and breaks down the stigma of mental health.
I want to ask our producer real quick to run this interview that we have, because it's very prevalent as well as in the African American household. We did a lot of interviews this past week, and I want to see if Erica can run this interview real quick about cultural differences.
In the African American household, culturally, everything is kind of kept in the household. You're the strong Black woman. You can handle it. It's okay.
You can deal with this. Be that strong woman, and just a friend, she was told by her mother-in-law, like, just like submit and just do it for just stay in it for the kids. And I was like, that is the worst advice you could give anyone. But
obviously very
they were probably told that, or they heard that in some capacity. And so it's almost, you have to break that cultural cycle of, would you call it ignorance, or what would you call it, or just?
It's generational
trauma.
abuse and trauma. Absolutely.
But it has something to do with TV shows like this, or just because everybody's part of multiple cultures, and part of the culture is letting people know that they don't have to, that's not the only option, that there are many versions of the way you can live your life. And it evolves. And it also has to do with what are your options in terms of employment for yourself, or, you know, just being able to define your own world in a new context. So, but that helps. That, again, what people were saying. If your friend can come up to you and say, you know, maybe this is what our grandmothers did, but we don't have to do this. And our grandmothers would want us to not be doing this. They want things to be getting better.
Yeah, we're talking about the shame and the stigma that within families, but you mentioned the two families, the two people who were being abused. They lived next door to each other in an apartment, so they knew what was going on. It's such a taboo subject, and people don't want to get involved, or they're afraid to get involved. They don't want to make things worse. But what are the best steps that someone can take if they can see a neighbor or a friend dealing with this to help rescue them and get them out of that situation?
How do you support somebody?
There's 3 R's that are really helpful. Recognize that this is an abusive dynamic. Let's say in your observations of somebody,
like acknowledge it.
Acknowledge, recognize in that. Respond, but respond in a way that isn't shaming. Don't ask, why do you leave? Ask, why don't you leave? Ask, how can I help?
And do it privately. I think that's a really important piece
Really
of
important,
this,
thank you.
having the conversation alone with the person that you're worried about, because you can make that situation worse if you try to call somebody out.
Or can I call someone for you?
Yeah,
Can I call the Houston Area Women's Center for you?
And we have a lot of friends and family members calling. And you know, the attitude is, I believe you. It's not your fault, and help is available. And then that 3rd R is refer. And the reason is because our staff are trained in safety planning, and are trained in being able to identify red flags or dynamics that could mean this situation is likely lethal. So what on the surface, because the person's been navigating it as best they can, might not look like a particularly lethal situation, there are key questions you can ask. One might be, has your abuser threatened to kill himself? Now that might not be something you'd think, but that's a question we ask on the hotline to really try and figure out how dire is the situation. So refer
What the abuser's mental state
what the
is.
abuser's mental state is. So refer to trained professionals. These kinds of dynamics are complex, and if it's somebody you know, inevitably you're going to be emotionally involved, and you're going to do your best, but so it's really helpful to make a call and a referral to organizations that are able to attend to the unique considerations of that caller and make sure resources are available.
Anyone else want to add to that? Anything
Some
to
of the
that?
best advice I heard is that survivors are in this situation where they are constantly walking on eggshells and having to think about this abuser. So the more you can focus the conversation on their needs, on their safety, on their emotion, it does not help to say, oh, that person shouldn't be doing that and how dare they, to focus the conversation on your person, on your loved one, because that's probably the first time that's happened for them in a long time.
Yeah. We'll speak about impact. We obviously know the impact that is on the individual facing the abuse, but when there are children or other family members in the household, they're witnessing this, experiencing this, talk about the impact that it has on them. And not only at that moment, but potentially down the line in their future relationships.
I think children are often some of the most forgotten, we say survivors, but victims of domestic violence. In our residential campus, up to 40% of our clients are children, meaning they're living with mom in the shelter. And throughout our service delivery model, we serve children. Children who are witnesses to abuse, not even necessarily the victim, but witnesses, are more likely to either become a victim or a perpetrator. And
that's why it's so silly when people say stay for the kids.
Yeah.
Yes.
We've had two clients be interviewed here on Channel 2, and both of them were, the precipice for them leaving was their children saying, Mom, you can't do this again.
Right.
We can't keep doing this. And their children push them to call our hotlines.
Oh, that's
and another thing we're seeing too is that a lot of the times they're saying, well, the kids didn't see it.
Yeah.
The kids are not aware of it.
Like a denial.
And then there's a denial of the fact that I can suffer silently myself when my kids are not part of this. But as soon as we open it up and have conversation with the kids and the family, the kids are aware of what's going on in the home.
Yeah, and when moms
Kids observe
thrive,
it.
kids thrive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, most definitely, most definitely. Okay, all right. Rachna, Emilee, Elizabeth, and Jaime, thank you so much. This has been a great kickoff
Thank
to
you for
these 90
having
minutes for
hard
sure.
conversations, which we can do. They're difficult to have, but we can have difficult conversations, and I think just help with ideas and support. And thank you for all you do in your community and in your organization, because without you, our Houstonians would have nowhere to go. So
thank you for the platform.
And you're helping change the pattern.
Absolutely.
Thank you very
Doing our
much.
best for sure.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, though.